So I'm getting some comments on my Hereditary video. I'm getting some comments on Reddit when it's being discussed for the whole movie Hereditary and whether or not there was actually any mental illness involved at all. So there's a big debate here, because obviously in my original video I said, hey, I thought this was gonna have a lot more of a mental illness twist to it and not have any kind of supernatural or like cult related things, even though they clearly set up the cult stuff early on. And other people are like, no, it is all mental illness. It's literally all just a figment in Annie and Peter's mind, which at one point I thought it could have been. There's like a clear dividing line in the movie where it switches off being possible that it's all just happening in Annie and Peter's head, like I mentioned in my kind of like initial thoughts and review video. But there's still people who are defending that it is all just in their head, and I'm kind of gonna lay out my thoughts on Hereditary and why I don't believe that's a thing, but I do still believe that there could be a little bit of a mental health aspect involved, at least with Annie and probably a little bit with Peter. So what some people have to understand is that just because you didn't get a hereditary passed down mental illness from your parents, the way you are raised can cause you to have certain types of mental illnesses. While some things are just chemical imbalances and it's just the way you're born to be, there is possibility that things like trauma, like abuse, like a lot of things that happen in your childhood can lead you to have certain mental illnesses or lead you to just react to situations in a way that you wouldn't normally had that not happen. One of the best examples of this, PTSD. There are tons of people who are fully sound of mind who go overseas, experience war, and come back traumatized. So in that front, it's very possible that Peter and Annie, and even Annie's brother that we never meet because he's already passed away, could have had some level of a mental illness or at least mental anguish and stress. So they mention specifically when she goes through the family issues of mental health, she mentions that the brother had hung himself, and as the movie progresses, you realize this is 100% because the grandmother was definitely going to pass the spirit or the power of payment into him, into the brother. And I guess he either catches on or it gets to the point where he can't handle the mental anguish that he's experiencing, and rather than getting into a situation where he can be possessed and taken over by that spirit, he kills himself. He takes himself out of the equation. I was honestly waiting for a moment where Peter might have just ended up killing himself because of the sheer amount of crap that he was forced to deal with. So if he ends up killing himself because of all the stuff that the mom's doing to prepare him to accept payment, that's still that's a reaction to a mental health stimulus. Then you have Annie, who's also pointed out multiple issues that she's had with her mother, lots of stresses, lots of disagreements, probably comes across as your parent being a narcissist in some ways, and that can cause people to grow up with a lot of mental health issues and can cause a lot of, really negative emotions in a person. So while she herself doesn't have schizophrenia necessarily, like they have proposed, like a lot of these people are proposing is the major subset of the story, she probably has a lot of anxiety, a lot of mental stress that's all caused from her mom. And then we get to Peter, who woke up in the middle of the night with his mom trying to kill him. That is going to cause you some mental ass stress. Have you seen Star Wars The Last Jedi? Kylo Ren literally becomes like a little monster child because he wakes up with Luke Skywalker over. This is a bad example for this scenario. Okay, we'll steer back from that. But if you woke up covered in paint thinner with your mom standing over you with a match and it's you and your sister and you're covered, you're gonna have some problems. You're gonna probably be a little bit fucked up. You're probably gonna have some PTSD because you're like, I don't know if I'm gonna wake up in the middle of the night to my mom trying to kill me again. And she just explains it away with sleepwalking, but there's a really good chance that that was potentially some kind of subconscious reaction to her trying to protect her children. If the children are dead, no one can pass the spirit or the power of payment on. Somebody said, she was being possessed at that time, but like, why would he want to kill his host bodies? So I don't know why, but honestly, that's a reaction to that. And honestly, sleepwalking is something that can be caused by mental anguish and trauma. So then on top of the fact that his mom tries to kill him, he accidentally kills his sister, which is going to make you traumatized. That's going to cause some PTSD. That's going to cause a lot of issues in your life. If you accidentally killed your sister and then ended up in like a state where you just went to bed and your mom had to find the body, like that's gonna mess you up. So that right there, that is gonna cause mental anguish. And that's a very important part because I do believe that the mental anguish the characters start to experience is why it becomes easier for them to be host bodies. I think that 100% is the reason why, and it's actually part of the process of preparing a person to be overtaken by the god. If you are of sound mind and body, you are not a good host for somebody to come into because you have enough of yourself to fight off that intrusion. So I honestly think that breaking somebody down at their core in an emotional way is a key aspect of having this ritual take place, which is why Annie's brother would have ended up killing himself, because they were preparing his body for that transition and he just couldn't handle it and killed himself. So I do think that there is at least some manner of mental health issues going on, but not to the extent that they're presented early on, because the big thing, like literally everything, ends up being explained by this cult and coven theory. Now, we're getting into why there's definitely an actual cult and a coven, a thing going on. So, like I mentioned early on, the mom specifically mentions, Annie mentions, that her mother was a very private person, a very skeptical person, so she'd probably be very nervous that there's all these random people that no one seems to know at her funeral. And then you have that moment where Charlie's looking at the body and this guy smiles at her, just a creepy smile. And there's like no real reason as to why this guy would be smiling at her or why any of these people are even at this funeral. So that's tip number one, that there's a coven or cult type thing going on. They do give you the signs early on. It's just that as more time passes, you kind of forget and you get so wrapped up in just this family's little drama because they do such a good job acting. And then obviously, once the Charlie thing happens, with the head against the pole, it's kind of hard to focus on other things. Then there's a couple of other moments. So one of the moments where Peter is smoking weed, he blows the smoke out the window. Somebody outside his window, you suddenly see smoke going in the other direction as if he's being watched. So this is one of the cult and or coven members keeping an eye on the situation. Now, I was inclined to believe that it could have been a mental health issue pretty much right up until the point that they do the seance with Charlie. And I could have even tried to explain some of that away, but the seance where they conjure what they think is Charlie, and the flames shoot out of the candle. Steve, the father, who would have no tie to mental health issues, he's just married in and looks under the table to see if there's a reason why flames would be shooting out of this candle. He looks under, there's nothing there. There's clearly nothing there. Things are happening in the house, and there's no actual explanation for it. He still tries to ignore it and say that, everything's, it's fine. You're now going through mental anguish because your mother is dead and your daughter is dead and you don't know how to handle your emotions. And he just kind of turns it into I need to protect Peter. Because there's even a part where she goes to try to find Joan again and nobody's home, and then you kind of see inside the apartment and see that there's all this stuff that that Charlie had been working on, and all these different animal heads and weird ritualistic things. And even at that point, I was like, she could be dealing with dissociative identity disorder, because it even says the mom had dissociative identity disorder right when she's in that support group meeting. So I was like, man, she could be going into different people in her mind and not realizing it and doing all of these different things. So I was fully content to believe that that was a possibility. But then it turns again to the cult thing. The grandmother never had dissociative identity disorder. She was just preparing this god for its ideal host body, which had to be a man. And Joan was just there to try to push it along. Once the grandmother died, they needed somebody to take over that process. Other things that kind of lend into this is that Annie specifically mentioned that she had tried to have a miscarriage in multiple ways, but then the grandmother was so involved in her life that it just never ended up happening. But then because of the stresses that her mom caused her, she cut her out once Peter was born, which means that she wasn't able to prepare Peter in any way to take over payments. So once Charlie was born, Annie allowed herself to be guilted by her mom to allow her in her life, and she became obsessed. She wouldn't even let Annie feed her. So there's probably all sorts of stuff that was happening and going into preparing that psyche to accept payment. And then when it comes to Steve catching fire, people are wondering, oh, well, why did the book start setting Annie on fire originally, but then it set Steve on fire when she threw it in? I'm pretty sure that the book was possessed by payment, and he had the ability to choose who it affected and who it injured because they'd all touched it. They had all been there for the seance. They had all been part of that ritual. So I think he tricks Annie into thinking that it's her so that he can take out Steve, because Steve specifically mentioned that his main priority is protecting Peter. And I think it's kind of gearing up to a moment where he's planning on taking Peter away from the situation, away from the hostility of her, until she can kind of figure her stuff out. Because the more time passes, the more he thinks that she has some kind of problem. And then it gets to the point where even he thinks that she's the one who dug up the grandmother. So obviously Payman's going to see him as a threat, and then therefore had to take out Steve as a way to prevent him from removing his ideal host in Peter. So by the end of the movie, I'm pretty much 100% convinced that while there is an allegory to the demons that are passed on to us by family that maybe we don't want, maybe we try to ignore, but you just can't because it's there, it's been given to you, and you have to deal with it. Like I mentioned, in a lot of the ways, the trauma that your family leaves you with is something that you're going to have to deal with whether or not you want to, and it can cause you a lot of problems down the road. So I do believe that there is an allegory for that in this movie, and that is what they're hinting at a lot. The movie itself clearly has an actual cult, an actual coven, and an actual god possession by the end of the movie. They literally break Peter down to the point that he physically can't handle the fight anymore, and then once he jumps out the window, he has broken himself down so physically and mentally to the point that Payman can take over. Payman can kind of just slide right on into the host body. Also, one of the scenes there, you can actually see the cult members when the last time it does that really quick day to night transition. The cult members are surrounding the house. So yeah, I guess by the end of this, I'm making the argument that while no, not all of this was happening in their mind, while a lot of people think that is a possibility, because again, like I mentioned, extreme moments of stress and anguish can lead somebody to start experiencing mental illness, and be due to the stress, it can bring out a person's mental illness. There's just too many things happening that point to it being completely real and actually happening to ignore it. Honestly, there's points in this movie where it could go either way, but that is my 2 cents, because I've had some people being like, no, it's exactly what you wanted it to be. It is completely mental health related, and it's like, but it's not. So let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. As always, thank you to my patrons that have decided to try to support me doing more of these kind of like video essays, quick discussions on movie things. That is going to do it for today's video. Thank you all so much for watching. Have a fantastic day. We'll catch you all later.